Okay, we're on to our final storyteller of the evening. He is John LYNDON. As it's already been mentioned, he has a connection with Alfred Cooper, who's already told a wonderful story here this evening. And he knows Alfred Cooper through John's brother, Twiggs. And we all agreed back in the green room that it sure is a small world. John LYNDON.
I think there were a couple of interesting members of my family. One of them was my brother Twiggs that Alfred mentioned. Twiggs died in a skydiving accident in 1979. He was a risk taker. He lived life over the edge, and it eventually caught up with him. When he was 22 years old, he and some friends went out to L.A., and Twiggs got a job selling shoes in a shoe store. Little Richard was playing in a club out there. Twiggs was a big fan of Richard's. He went to the show, got back in the dressing room, told Richard that he was from Macon, as Richard was, we were from Macon, was a big fan, and just wanted to say hello. Richard said he needed a road manager. My brother wanted to be a road manager. So Twiggs said, well, selling shoes in a shoe store, being on the road with little Richard, not a difficult decision. So he went out on tour with Richard. Jimi Hendrix was lead guitar player in Richard's band at that time. And they did that tour, and when that finished, Twiggs said that he could never repay Richard for the debt that he owed him because Richard taught him everything he needed to know about being on the road. Twiggs came back to Macon, hooked up with Phil Walden, went out on the road with Percy Sledge. Arthur Conley did a Stax Vote tour of Europe with Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Booker T and the MGs. Alfred mentioned the difficulties being out on the road. I've got a lot of stories about that, but I'll just tell one brief one in that Alfred broke the ice. So they're an integrated group traveling through the South on the Chitlin circuit, trying not to be confused with Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders were dying. So they had all sorts of ways of trying to get through the day. But they went a filling station in Mississippi, and this filling station attendant came up to him and said, boy, is this common where you come from? White boy driving a bunch of niggers around. And my brother said, well, most people don't realize I'm black. And the filling station attendant said to his friend, I believe he's the whitest one I ever seen. In 1967, Otis Redding's plane went down in Madison, Wisconsin, and Twiggs went up with Otis's wife, Zelma, to identify the bodies. Zelma wrote me a letter a couple of years ago saying she could never repay the kindness that he had shown her in the worst time of her life. And the R&B scene pretty much collapsed in Macon with Otis's death. Phil Walden was trying to look for the next act, and he put the Allman Brothers together. And Twiggs was the first road manager of the Allman Brothers. After Dwayne Allman died, Twiggs had the likeness of Dwayne's face tattooed on his left shoulder. And he had a tattoo of a band of the initials of the original Allman Brothers band on his right arm, upper arm. When Greg Allman saw his initials, he said to Twiggs, I see you put me right under your pit. My mother gave Twiggs a diamond, and he made it into a stud earring and stuck it in his ear. I mean, that may not be that uncommon today, but back in the 70s, it was a little unusual. The other interesting member of my family was my uncle Andrew LYNDON, my father's brother. Andrew was a writer. He was a spark to other writers. And in the late 1940s and 1950s, he was in New York, in Manhattan, with friends with Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams, Christopher Isherwood, Harper Lee, and others. Andrew was living with Truman when Truman was writing his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, sort of autobiographical about being raised by his aunt in Alabama. Andrew told me that even though Truman was brilliant, he was not particularly well read. Andrew, on one occasion, suggested to Truman that they go down to Radio City Music Hall to see Great Expectations, the film that had been released. They went down, was watching the movie. Andrew said Truman just got nervous and anxious and twitchy. He couldn't figure out what the problem was, and finally Truman turned to him and said, "Darling, they are stealing my plot." In the 1960s, Truman asked Andrew if he would accompany him to Kansas to help put the materials together for the book he was writing called In Cold Blood. Andrew told me that he told Truman that he did not think Kansas could handle both of them and suggested to Truman that he take Harper Lee, which is what he did and which, of course, made all the difference. Well, these two worlds, the rock and roll world of my brother Twiggs and the literary world of my Uncle Andrew, came together on one occasion. And that happened in 1976 when Tennessee Williams was having the world premiere of his last play in Atlanta. Andrew was living in Macon at the time. Twiggs was off the road with the Allman Brothers waiting on the next tour. And Tennessee contacted Andrew and asked him if he'd be interested in coming up and seeing the play, which of course Andrew really wanted to see. But Andrew did not drive. So he called Twiggs and asked Twiggs if he'd be interested in going, and Twiggs told me that sure, he'd be happy to take him. So the two of them went up, saw the play, went backstage to say hello to Tennessee after the performance, and Tennessee invited them back to the hotel room. And Andrew said, "Well, what about it, Twiggs? Do you want to go to the room?" And Twiggs said, you know, he knew what was at the room, groupies. And he said, "Yeah, let's go to the room." He said he got to the room and they were all boys. So Twiggs said he was just hanging out, you know, waiting for the conversations to end so he could drive Andrew back to Macon. When Andrew called him over and said, "Tennessee," he said, "my nephew Twiggs, he's one of my very favorite nephews." He said, "There's only one problem with him." And Tennessee said, "What's that?" Andrew said, "He is a raving heterosexual." And Tennessee Williams said, "Oh, what a pity. His earrings showed such promise." Thank you very much.